April 11, 1951. A telephone rings in Paris. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of NATO, picks up the receiver. The voice on the other end delivers news that shocks the military world. President Truman has just fired General Douglas MacArthur. Eisenhower's response? According to some accounts from those present in the room, he couldn't contain a slight smile. This wasn't just any firing. This was the dismissal of America's most decorated general, a living legend who had accepted Japan's surrender, ruled with sweeping authority during the occupation, and now commanded UN forces in Korea. And Eisenhower, the man who would become president just 2 years later, appeared pleased. But why? What dark history existed between these two titans of American military power? And what did MacArthur do that was so catastrophic that even his former colleagues quietly celebrated his downfall? The answer takes us back decades, through ego, insubordination, and a pattern of behavior that would ultimately threaten to escalate the Korean War into a far wider and potentially nuclear conflict. To understand Eisenhower's reaction, we need to understand their relationship, and it's far more complex than simple rivalry. In 1932, Douglas MacArthur was the Army Chief of Staff, the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. military. Eisenhower was a major assigned as MacArthur's assistant. For 7 years, Eisenhower worked directly under MacArthur, first in Washington and then in the Philippines, where MacArthur served as military advisor. This wasn't a mentorship of mutual respect. Eisenhower's private writings from this period revealed deep frustration. He described working with MacArthur as studying theatricalism and learning what not to do as a leader. In his diary entries, not published until decades later, Eisenhower wrote that MacArthur was as big a baby as ever and complained about his superior's vanity and dramatic flair. Yet MacArthur valued Eisenhower's organizational brilliance. He needed someone who could turn his grand visions into actionable plans, and Eisenhower excelled at this unglamorous work. But the relationship was strained by fundamental differences in leadership philosophy. MacArthur believed in the cult of personality, that great men shaped history through force of will. Eisenhower believed in systems, cooperation, and teamwork. MacArthur craved publicity and recognition. Eisenhower, at least at this point in his career, worked behind the scenes. When World War II erupted, their paths diverged dramatically. MacArthur commanded in the Pacific, becoming perhaps the most famous American general through carefully managed press coverage and bold proclamations. Eisenhower rose through European command, eventually becoming Supreme Allied Commander, technically outranking MacArthur by war's end. The student had surpassed the teacher, and MacArthur, according to several biographers, never quite forgave that fact. By 1951, MacArthur was 71 years old and had spent the last 6 years governing occupied Japan with extraordinary authority under the Allied occupation structure. He had become accustomed to getting his way. Eisenhower, now 60, commanded NATO forces in Europe and had learned the delicate art of international coalition management. When that phone call came in April 1951, Eisenhower was receiving news that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. His former boss had been fired in disgrace. The question is, what exactly had MacArthur done? June 25, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. President Truman, determined to contain communist expansion, committed American forces under United Nations authorization. He needed a commander for this operation. Against the advice of several advisors who had reservations about MacArthur's tendency toward independence, Truman appointed him Supreme Commander of UN forces in Korea. MacArthur was already in Tokyo. He had experience in Asia, and his reputation seemed perfect for the role. Initially, things went MacArthur's way, spectacularly so. After North Korean forces pushed South Korean and American troops into a desperate defensive perimeter around Busan, MacArthur conceived one of the most daring operations in modern military history, the Inchon Landing. On September 15, 1950, MacArthur's forces conducted an amphibious assault at Inchon, a port city near Seoul, with some of the most treacherous tidal conditions in the world. Military experts had called the plan madness. MacArthur insisted it would work precisely because it was so unexpected. He was right. The landing succeeded brilliantly, cutting North Korean supply lines and turning the tide of the war. By October, UN forces had pushed north of the 38th parallel, driving deep into North Korea. MacArthur's stated objective: the complete reunification of Korea and the total destruction of the North Korean regime. Seoul was liberated. Victory seemed within grasp. But then came the warnings. Intelligence reports suggested massive Chinese troop movements near the Korean border. The CIA estimated as many as 200,000 Chinese soldiers were positioned in Manchuria. MacArthur dismissed these concerns. At a meeting with President Truman on Wake Island on October 15, 1950, MacArthur assured the president that Chinese intervention was unlikely. If China did intervene, MacArthur claimed, it would be the greatest slaughter in military history, implying easy American victory.
Truman, according to records of the meeting, seemed satisfied with this assessment. He needed reassurance that the war would end quickly, especially with midterm elections approaching. MacArthur provided that reassurance with his characteristic confidence. He was catastrophically wrong. On November 25, 1950, approximately 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River into North Korea. It was one of the largest military interventions in modern history. UN forces, caught off guard despite the intelligence warnings MacArthur had dismissed, faced a devastating offensive. What followed was one of the most brutal retreats in American military history. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers fought frostbite as viciously as they fought the enemy. The Marines' fighting withdrawal from the chosen reservoir became legendary, but it was still a retreat. MacArthur's assurances had proven not just wrong, but disastrously so. Thousands of soldiers paid the price for his miscalculation. The war he promised would be over by Christmas had transformed into a nightmare that threatened to engulf all of Asia. And this is where MacArthur's response became truly alarming. Faced with the Chinese intervention, MacArthur didn't accept responsibility for his miscalculation. Instead, he began publicly advocating for dramatic escalation, including strategies that terrified Washington. In December 1950, MacArthur requested authorization to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, inside China itself, beyond Korean borders. He wanted to blockade the Chinese coast. Most alarmingly, he raised the possibility of using atomic weapons against Chinese forces and potentially against targets inside China. President Truman faced an impossible situation. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. China and the Soviet Union had signed a mutual defense treaty. If the United States attacked China directly, particularly with nuclear weapons, it could trigger World War III, this time with nuclear arsenals on both sides. Truman and his advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, determined that the Korean War must remain limited. The objective shifted from total victory to stabilizing a defensive line roughly along the original border, preventing communist expansion without risking a broader war that could escalate beyond control. MacArthur's assurances had proven not just wrong, but disastrously so. Thousands of soldiers paid the price for his miscalculation.
The war he promised would be over by Christmas had transformed into a nightmare that threatened to engulf all of Asia. And this is where MacArthur's response became truly alarming. Faced with the Chinese intervention, MacArthur didn't accept responsibility for his miscalculation. Instead, he began publicly advocating for dramatic escalation, including strategies that terrified Washington. In December 1950, MacArthur requested authorization to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, inside China itself, beyond Korean borders. He wanted to blockade the Chinese coast. Most alarmingly, he raised the possibility of using atomic weapons against Chinese forces and potentially against targets inside China. President Truman faced an impossible situation. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. China and the Soviet Union had signed a mutual defense treaty. If the United States attacked China directly, particularly with nuclear weapons, it could trigger World War III, this time with nuclear arsenals on both sides. Truman and his advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, determined that the Korean War must remain limited. The objective shifted from total victory to stabilizing a defensive line roughly along the original border, preventing communist expansion without risking a broader war that could escalate beyond control. MacArthur fundamentally disagreed with this strategy, and rather than accept civilian leadership's decision, he began publicly undermining it. In interviews with journalists, MacArthur criticized the limited war concept. He argued that there is no substitute for victory, and that fighting a limited war with limited objectives was a betrayal of the soldiers doing the fighting. On its face, this argument had emotional appeal. Who wants to send soldiers to fight and die without seeking complete victory? But MacArthur's position ignored the nuclear context. His proposed escalation risked expanding a regional conflict into a global catastrophe. In December 1950, Truman issued a directive requiring all military personnel to clear public statements on foreign policy through Washington. MacArthur ignored it. In February 1951, MacArthur sent a statement to the House Republican leader, Joseph Martin, criticizing Truman's containment strategy and suggesting that nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan should be deployed against mainland China. Martin read MacArthur's letter on the floor of Congress, making it national news. This was extraordinary insubordination. A military commander was publicly contradicting and criticizing his commander-in-chief's foreign policy, not through proper channels or private communication, but through media and political opponents. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of them, began expressing serious concerns. These were not politicians, but MacArthur's fellow generals and admirals, Omar Bradley, Hoyt Vandenberg, Lawton Collins, and Forrest Sherman. According to declassified documents, they discussed among themselves that MacArthur seemed to believe his authority superseded civilian control. Then came the final straw. On March 24, 1951, just as the Truman administration was preparing to approach China with potential peace negotiations, MacArthur issued his own unauthorized statement, essentially an ultimatum to China. He threatened to expand the war to China's coastal areas and interior bases if negotiations didn't proceed on his terms. It was a general conducting his own foreign policy, potentially sabotaging presidential diplomacy. Truman later wrote in his memoirs that this was open defiance of my orders as President and Commander-in-Chief, and that by this act MacArthur left me no choice. I could no longer tolerate his insubordination. But firing Douglas MacArthur wasn't simple. He was immensely popular with the American public, lionized by many conservatives, and seen as a war hero. Truman knew the political cost would be enormous. The president convened his top advisors. Secretary of Defense George Marshall, himself a five-star general and MacArthur's contemporary, reluctantly agreed that MacArthur had to be relieved. So did Dean Acheson. Most significantly, all four members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff concurred that MacArthur should be removed from command. Omar Bradley would later testify that MacArthur's strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. On April 11, 1951, at 1 a.m. Washington time, President Truman signed the order relieving General Douglas MacArthur of all his commands: Supreme Commander, Allied Powers in Japan, Commander-in-Chief United Nations Command, and Commander-in-Chief Far East. The news reached MacArthur not through official channels. Truman had planned for the message to be delivered properly, but through a press report. An aide heard it on the radio and informed MacArthur during lunch. The general who had governed Japan with sweeping powers, who had accepted the surrender of the Japanese Empire, who had rarely been contradicted or overruled for 6 years, had been fired and learned about it from the press.
Which brings us back to that telephone call in Paris. When Eisenhower received news of MacArthur's firing, some accounts suggest he showed visible relief and even satisfaction. General Alfred Gruenther, Eisenhower's chief of staff at NATO, later recalled that Eisenhower appeared pleased by the news. Kay Summersby, Eisenhower's wartime secretary and close confidant, noted in her writings that Eisenhower had been concerned about MacArthur's increasingly erratic behavior for months. According to Stars and Stripes, when Dwight Eisenhower heard that President Truman had fired General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951, he reacted with the phrase, "Well, I'll be darned." Now, why the satisfaction? Several factors came together. First, Eisenhower deeply believed in civilian control of the military. His experience commanding Allied forces in Europe had taught him that military operations must serve political objectives, not dictate them. MacArthur's public insubordination violated this fundamental principle of American democracy. Second, Eisenhower feared MacArthur's strategy would destroy NATO before it could even be built. Eisenhower's entire mission in 1951 was creating a unified Western defense. If America became embroiled in a massive land war in Asia, possibly one that escalated beyond control, European allies would lose faith in American leadership and protection. The Atlantic Alliance could collapse. Third, and this is more speculative but supported by private correspondence, Eisenhower had never forgiven MacArthur for certain episodes in their shared past. In 1932, when Eisenhower worked for MacArthur, the Bonus Army of World War I veterans marched on Washington demanding early payment of promised bonuses. MacArthur, as Army Chief of Staff, personally led the military operation to disperse them with cavalry, infantry, and tanks, far exceeding his orders. Eisenhower had advised against MacArthur personally leading the operation, warning it would be politically catastrophic and inappropriate for the Army's highest-ranking officer to be involved in a domestic law enforcement action. MacArthur ignored him. The resulting images of the U.S. Army using force against American veterans damaged the military's reputation and, many historians argue, unnecessarily escalated the situation. Eisenhower had witnessed firsthand MacArthur's tendency to believe rules didn't apply to him, that his judgment superseded orders, and that dramatic personal action was always preferable to restraint. Now, 19 years later, that same pattern had led to MacArthur's downfall, but this time on a global stage, with the risk of catastrophic escalation. According to some interpretations, Eisenhower's reported satisfaction wasn't petty revenge. Biographer Stephen Ambrose suggested it represented relief that a dangerous situation had been resolved before it could spiral further out of control. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. Millions lined the streets for parades. He delivered a dramatic farewell address to Congress with his famous line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away."
For a moment, it seemed Truman had made a catastrophic political mistake. The president's approval ratings plummeted to 22%, among the lowest ever recorded for a sitting president. But then came the Senate hearings. The Armed Forces Committee and Foreign Relations Committee held joint hearings investigating MacArthur's dismissal. The testimony lasted 7 weeks. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, delivered devastating testimony explaining why all the military chiefs had supported MacArthur's removal. When asked directly, Bradley confirmed that MacArthur's strategy would have led to the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Secretary of State Acheson methodically demonstrated how MacArthur's actions had undermined diplomatic efforts. Defense Secretary Marshall, whose credibility was unimpeachable, supported the decision. The more the public learned about MacArthur's actual conduct, the more support for Truman's decision grew. MacArthur's popularity began to fade. His attempt to parlay public sympathy into a presidential campaign never gained traction. By 1952, when Eisenhower ran for president himself, the MacArthur controversy had largely subsided. Eisenhower won in a landslide. As president, Eisenhower would face his own military challenges, but he consistently applied the lessons of the MacArthur affair. When his own generals advocated for nuclear weapons during the 1954 crisis over Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, Eisenhower refused. When advisors pushed for intervention in various Cold War hotspots, Eisenhower exercised restraint, keeping conflicts limited and avoiding escalation that could spiral out of control. He had learned from watching MacArthur's fall that military genius doesn't excuse insubordination, that civilian control isn't optional, and that sometimes the greatest service a leader can provide is knowing when not to fight.
MacArthur lived another 13 years after his firing, dying in 1964 at age 84. He never admitted error in his handling of the Korean command. To the end, he maintained that his strategy had been correct and that limited war was fundamentally flawed. Eisenhower, who died in 1969, rarely spoke publicly about MacArthur after becoming president. But in private papers released decades later, he wrote that April 11, 1951 represented a necessary assertion of constitutional government, and that MacArthur's relief, while painful, probably prevented a far greater catastrophe. That reported smile in Paris, witnessed by only a few, may have represented something profound, the recognition that American democracy had survived a critical test. A popular general had challenged civilian authority, risked dangerous escalation through insubordination, and been held accountable. The system worked. And Eisenhower, who would soon inherit that system as its leader, understood what that moment meant. This video presents historical events based on memoirs, biographies, archival documents, congressional testimony, and scholarly research. Some details, including witness accounts of personal reactions, come from secondary sources and recollections that may vary in reliability. Historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. Viewers are encouraged to consult the sources listed in the description for further research and diverse perspectives on these events. This content is intended for educational purposes.